glad you're here. Please give yourself a little bit of time to kind of mentally turn off from all the other everything and just give yourself this 20 minutes to focus on learning evolution. Welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. We are discussing the tree of life today. You watched a video that introduced you to a lot of these concepts, and now we're going to dig into it a little bit deeper. If we look at the modern tree of life, this is one of the depictions of what it looks like. And on the video, one of the scientists talked about that we know of about, almost 2 million species, but we think that we're probably closer to 9 million species on the planet. And mapping where those all fit in relationship to each other is the endeavor of phylogeneticists, so evolutionary biologists that are specifically interested in relationships. We talked a lot about Darwin, and this is a notation from Darwin's book on the origin of species. I shouldn't say a notation. This is the only image. And you might recognize it because there are a lot of evolutionary biologists who get this tattoo or have a t-shirt like this. And this was his representation of this idea that he had, that if natural selection is true and evolution is true, that everything must come from a common ancestor, and that could be represented by a tree. And this has turned out to be very accurate. He acknowledged that, and I don't know if you saw all the little question marks pop up there, that we don't know which organisms go where. Unfortunately, so we don't know what goes here. We don't know what's closer related to that. We don't know what's more closely related to this and this. We don't know. Unfortunately, birds, didn't send us a message, which would have been just really polite, and say, hey, I'm actually a reptile. We don't know. They don't wear barcodes. They don't wear signs. So it's a long endeavor, and the video talked about that, to get the computational power and understanding in programs to be able to do what we can do now. Took 10 years of intense focused work. It's a long endeavor to figure out what's related to what. Before we start digging into the process of how that happens, how phylogenies are formed, first we're going to talk about the phylogeny themselves, the tree itself. So a phylogenetic tree or a phylogeny. What it is essentially a map. A phylogeny is a representation of relationships. And what I think of it is a map of evolutionary history. And just like when you took geography, the core of that was learning the map. This phylogeny, understanding the relationships, understanding how to read this map, is one of the key skills in evolutionary biology and understanding evolution. So we're going to talk about some key concepts, ways to read and understand the tree. You'll see trees written multiple different ways. But research on this tells us that students best understand trees represented in this format. This is the rectangular format, and there are different ways. You don't have, this isn't the only way to draw it, but I will attempt to stick to this format consistently. Some weird noise happening in my house. I'm not sure what that's about. Okay, so this is a phylogenetic tree, and another way, I'm just going to draw it so that you know, you've probably seen this before. Another way that people will represent phylogenies would be something like this. And you'll see trees like this very often. But research tells us those are hard to read and hard to understand, so that's not the way that I'm going to represent them. A couple of important places on a tree is at the end of a tree, usually at the end of a tree, are extant species. So I'm just going to use letters to represent those species. And typically a tree, the ends of the tree are what we call extant species. So this is the opposite of extinct. There are absolutely trees that also include extinct species, but typically this is extant species. And then if we move kind of back deeper into the tree, there are these locations. I'm going to use this. Places where you can see that things kind of diverge or branch. I don't know how well you can see that. And each of these places where you see two branches come off of a single line, these are called nodes. So each and every one of these that I've marked in blue is a node. And what each node represents is what's called a common ancestor. So what that means then is that species A, if we're using species A and species B share this individual, the species, it's not an individual, share this species as a common ancestor. They both share ancestry. So like how you and your sister share a mom, or how you and your sister share a mom, for example, or you and your brother share a mom, then these two species share a common ancestor. If we take any common ancestor and all of their descendants, I'm going to erase that line. So if we take this common ancestor that I indicated here, that eraser is not very specific, is it? And all of its descendants. This common ancestor right here, and all of its descendants. So that would be this whole thing, that common ancestor plus those two branches that descended from it. What this is called is a clade. Clade, C-L-A-D-E. My writing is not fantastic. So this is called a clade. This is one clade. If we go back further, we can include this clade with another clade. Let's say that we want to go back to this common ancestor. So that means that we would include this common ancestor and all of its descendants, and that would be this whole thing, everything I've encased in that blue color. And this would be another clade. So a common ancestor and all of its descendants together is a clade. I'll write that down. I'm going to send you to a website that has all these definitions too. The common ancestor and all of its descendants is a clade. An important thing to recognize and understand also about a tree is, if you look at a tree, I'm just going to make one up. No, I don't like that. Okay, just making up a tree. Let's imagine that this is what this tree looks like. A really important point is that all of these species, genera, whatever level we want, they've all been evolving for the same amount of time. All of these lineages have been evolving for the same amount of time. And again, I'm going to send you to a website that has all this on it. I actually built the website. Kind of proud of that. So all these lineages have been evolving for the same amount of time. So some of them are going to be very, very different from their common ancestor. So here's the common ancestor, and species A may be very different from the common ancestor. Species B may have almost no differences. But both of their lineages, the lineage of species A and the lineage of species B, have both been evolving for the same amount of time. So there's no such thing as more, quote unquote, highly evolved. The evolution has been occurring for the same amount of time. Species A being very different from its common ancestor and species B being almost exactly the same as its common ancestor does not mean that species B is less evolved. And it does not mean that species A is more evolved. There's no such thing. Another important point, I don't think I've made enough white space for this. I'll do this. Another important point is that not all species are shown on a phylogenetic tree. So if we're looking at a tree and we're like, here, let's do this, here, okay? And we're interested in species A, D, F, and G. The tree isn't showing species B and C. They exist, but they're just not shown on the tree. Why? Well, maybe we're studying species A, D, F, and G, and we're not studying species B and C. So they're not on the tree. Maybe they're unsampled. That's what that means. So they're not in the sample. Maybe they're extinct. So I mentioned extinct, that most of the time what you're going to see here is extant species. Species that are extinct very, very often are not shown on phylogenetic trees. So if we're interested in, let's see, what would be a good way to model that? Okay, let's make extinct species green. So along the way to what's going on now, we know, we know that, you had all these branches that went extinct, right? Along the way. And they don't show up on the tree. They were there. They happened. But they didn't make it to present day. And so we don't see them. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of species. So unsampled, they can be unsampled as in we didn't include them. Whoever built the tree didn't include them. They can also be unsampled as in that extraordinarily large millions of species that we haven't discovered yet. So those are all important points about a phylogenetic tree. Okay. I think that's all the points that I wanted to make about that. Next really important point. So this phylogenetic tree, I'm sorry I'm saying so much. I'm trying not to. This phylogenetic tree, all I've done from the ones that I was drawing here is I've just turned it. Exact same thing, I've just turned it. Looking at this tree, another really, really important point about phylogenetic trees is that this representation that we're seeing here is not static. At those nodes, the tree can turn. So you can imagine it like a mobile, and those nodes can just rotate around each other. So, I did it again, I'm sorry. Species D is not any more closely related to species C than it is to species, yes it is. Sorry, I said that wrong. Ignore that. Just looked at the tree again. All right, take that back. Species C is not any more closely related to species B than it is to species A. It just happens to be laid out this way. And I'm going to show you what I mean if you're like, what are you talking about? Okay. Now what I've done is I've colored the lineages that lead to each of these species. Lineage A, lineage B, lineage C, lineage D, each are the same color as the letter. This is how the tree is laid out currently. But what we can do is we can switch with the position of lineage C and the position of the lineage leading to A and B. And that is the exact same tree. When we do that, these, that's not going to show up. These are equal. Same tree. Because all we did is, if you look at the two sides, all we did was switch the position. And we switched that position at a node. This node. We switched. All we did was we flipped it around. Exact same tree. So if we can flip at that node, we can also flip at that node. So here we flipped there. I'll use a different color. Maybe that will be helpful. And then we can also flip that node. And it's the exact same tree. So the position of where things are on the tree doesn't necessarily tell you what's more closely related, because in the image on the left, if you just glance at it, then it looks like species C is more closely related to species B. But that's not true. Because if we go back, before we flipped it, now it looks like species C is more closely related to species A. And that's because which side those two species are of the node, we can just flip it. And so that's not an indication of how closely related the species are. So what the heck is an indication of how closely related the species are, Dr. Wiggins? Well, if you look back at like the top of the tree, what we're looking for is how many bifurcations, how many splits apart are they? A and B here are one split apart. So they are more closely related to each other than they are to D, because between D and A and B, we've got two splits. A and B are more closely related than they are to D. They're more closely related to each other than they are to D. C is just as closely related to B as to A, as we said earlier. And if, I'm not going to further confuse that. So keep in mind, we can flip things at any node. People get a sort of fixed image or a fixed mindset of this, projection. But keep in mind that nodes can flip. Okay, so some other important terminology. A monophyletic group. Have you ever heard that word before? Monophyletic? Monophyletic group. I think it sounds really cool. So mono means one, right? That made that hard to see. Mono means one. Phyletic, phylogeny. One phylogeny group. This is an example of a monophyletic group. This is Canis. So dogs, wolves, coyotes, all of that. And if you look at this phylogeny, there is a single common ancestor right here that all of Canis can trace its ancestry back to. And so what I would like you to do looking at this group, so a monophyletic group contains all of the descendants from a common ancestor. And that common ancestor isn't the ancestor of also another group. On a phylogenetic tree, this is usually pretty easy to see. So this entire thing is a monophyletic group. There are also other monophyletic groups on this tree, and they're labeled with colors. The paper that this is from, I put a citation down here in the corner. The full citation is in your notes. But they color-coded the monophyletic groups, which groups are more closely related to each other. So the individuals in I'll use the same color later. The individuals in this monophyletic group are more closely related to each other than are the individuals in this monophyletic group. And same thing. This monophyletic group, they're all more closely related to each other than they are to the members of the other group. A paraphyletic group, it doesn't contain all of the species descended from the most recent common ancestor. And so you're looking at this and you might be like, that looks like a monophyletic group. Don't worry. I'm gonna make the point. When people talk about reptiles, traditionally, this is getting a little bit better, but reptiles is not a real thing phylogenetically, because people include only these clades, right? They don't include birds. But if you look back here, if you look at the ancestry, if we don't include birds, we're excluding part of the descendants. We're excluding one of the descendants of a common ancestor, because this entire group all descended from the same common ancestor. So reptiles are a paraphyletic group. And not a real thing, unless you include birds, which some people, when they say reptiles, they're starting to include birds, and then that is a monophyletic group. But traditionally, reptiles are the crocodilians, the squamates, which are snakes and lizards, tuataras, which are cool, and turtles. That's a paraphyletic group. Now, same image again, and I'm talking about something different. Yes, I am talking about something different. A polyphyletic group. So a polyphyletic group is really, what is a polyphyletic group? It's a mess. So this contains species that have descended from several ancestors, but those ancestors are also the ancestors of species classified into other groups. And the paraphyletic group I'm using as an example here would be this, and this is homeotherms. Animals that regulate their internal body temperature. People will use the word warm-blooded. The accurate term is homeotherms. Birds and mammals are both homeotherms, whereas crocodilians, squamates, tuataras, and turtles are not. So homeotherms is a paraphyletic group because it includes birds. Birds' common ancestor, most recent common ancestor is there. Then we go back and we go back, and the most recent common ancestor with birds should also include turtles, tuataras, squamates, and crocodilians, where in order to get the most recent common ancestor of mammals and birds, we would need to include this entire group. So homeothermy is not a monophyletic condition. What this indicates instead is that homeothermy evolved twice. That would be convergent evolution. So back here, this common ancestor was not a homeotherm, and then birds evolved homeothermy, and mammals evolved homeothermy, and this was convergent evolution. So they each evolved this characteristic separately. Okay, so that's where we'll stop with our introduction of phylogenetic trees, and we will pick it up with talking about the applications of phylogenetic trees.